those lovely people on the Red Rabbit Hole podcast who are absolutely mad. If I could talk about some of the weird stuff I discovered when researching my novel, The Crooked Medium's Guide to Murder, which is a spooky, sapphic Victorian murder mystery, and therefore I'll be talking about things spooky, Victorian, and murdery. Content warnings, some of this is a little bit icky. So, first question is, did the Victorians actually photograph the dead? You may have been told that Victorians propped up bodies and surrounded them by their relatives so that they could have a nice family photo. That's not actually true. They did take photographs of dead bodies on, in their beds, in their coffins, as a lovely memento, and then maybe the family were gathered around. But they didn't prop bodies up. That's a mistake based on the fact that you often had an iron frame behind you when you had an ordinary photograph taken in Victorian times, because although the cameras got better and better, you still had an exposure time of a few seconds, so you did have to stay absolutely still. But those weren't for corpses; they wouldn't have held a corpse. So that's definitely not true. What sort of outrageous things did spiritualists get up to? Leaving aside the question about whether anybody ever can speak to the dead, which I'm going to keep quiet about, they wrapped tables, raised tables, generated shells and fruit, spewed out ectoplasm, which is a kind of glowing green gas. They were always very careful to do these in very, very dark rooms. You couldn't see what was going on. Sometimes they flew, teleported, uh, bounced off the ceiling, and all those sorts of things. So we'll reserve judgment on a lot of those, whether those were done without trickery or not. In The Crooked Medium's Guide to Murder, Mrs. Ashton doesn't do any of that sort of grandstanding stuff, but what she can do is mimic voices very well, and she has a trick that allows her to pretend to speak to the dead, which certainly persuades a lot of people. She doesn't think she can speak to the dead herself. Um, were spiritualists bad people? Probably not. At least some of them were seriously trying to prove that there was life after death. They wanted consolation from death, which is a universal thing. Many of the spiritualists gave an opportunity for women to take part in public life. It was a very woman-led movement. Um, and that was probably one of the few forms of therapy available, was talking to somebody sympathetically about the possibility that there was life after death. So you can't condemn it, absolutely. Could you be bankrupted by a Victorian funeral? Yes, you could. There was massive, we would say, over expenditure, over pressure to have a proper funeral. Mourning got more and more extravagant. You expected to build bigger and better monuments, bigger and better graves, and so forth. And it got, in our eyes, excessive. And I think that the problem was, one of the big problems was, of course, that the poor were led to believe that an inferior funeral was a disgrace to the deceased, and you had to spend everything you could on a funeral. And that was in an era of really widespread poverty and very low wages. That was a massive problem. People borrowed, got into debt. This was at a time when the average working person in London was spending a very large proportion of their income just on rent and food, and it was very difficult to make a living. So people did get bankrupted. If they'd been prudent and had enough spare money, they could have joined a burial society. But it's unfortunately true that trying to do the right thing push many families into debt, and it's a problem that's come back in the modern day. To How icky was a Victorian post-mortem? So the first thing about post-mortems is that the Victorians did have a scientific approach to investigating death, and they could find out useful things. I'll talk about poisons in a little bit. But they didn't necessarily have anywhere terribly medical to carry them out. If you're in a big city, you'd be able to use the mortuary in a hospital. If you're in a town, there might possibly be somewhere you could do it, but quite often you had to resort to whatever you can get. And so you have accounts of them being done in the house where the person died. The post-mortem is taking place, in the garden shed sometimes, anywhere you could do it out of the way. So that was certainly not very nice. The second thing was in the earlier parts of the Victorian period, um, they had some very odd ideas about how you might detect horrible substances in the contents of the stomach, and they used to suggest that you taste or smell some of the insides of the human body, which, as they got to better understand germs, I think they stopped doing. Were there secret poisons that the Victorians couldn't detect? Well, probably there were some cases of poisoning that they couldn't detect. But the trouble was that for the poisoner, that there were three very effective and very easy to get hold of poisons, which are cyanide, um, strychnine, and arsenic. Great at doing the job, but none of them are undetectable. There are chemical tests for arsenic and cyanide. Cyanide has a very powerful smell, and the symptoms of strychnine and cyanide are very distinctive, so you immediately get warning. Now, you can slip arsenic poisoning under the radar if people think it's a long-standing illness, but there's a tremendously good chemical test, and once the pathologist suspects it's arsenic poisoning, you'll very quickly be able to prove it one way or the other. So Victorian novelists like to invent poisons that couldn't be detected because they thought the chemists were spoiling it all, but you probably could tell in a lot of cases of poisoning. Was Queen Victoria a drug pusher? Well, not personally. There were drugs all over the Victorian society, cocaine, hashish, and particularly opium. But the British Empire did have a policy of pushing opium onto other people. It was one of our most profitable trades, and after we got rid of slavery, and you know, the most obvious example of which were the wars that the British fought in China to make the Chinese emperor take mass quantities of opium. The first Opium War was triggered when the Chinese burned 1,400 tons of British opium, which was illegal in China, and we promptly declared war on them. So, yeah, it was a major problem of addiction in the UK. It was a major problem of addiction in China, and that's why it's very odd when some Victorians started to blame the Chinese for opium addiction, because kind of we started it. Um, what else? Were there any odd superstitions about death in the Victorian period? There were masses of superstitions. You're supposed to drape your mirrors, turn your photographs and paintings to the wall, stop the clocks, all designed to stop horrible things happening. And this ran alongside sort of normal Christian beliefs. I think that's, and it's quite interesting how these folk traditions survive. Was mourning over the top? Yes, I think mourning was over the top, but that's we live in a more informal age. The idea was it was socially prescribed what you did and what you didn't do, and it was all about performing grief outwardly, but not by what you wore, what you did, but not to actually not to actually emote too much in public. So the widow was hidden behind a veil, so you couldn't see her face. She supposed to stay at home most of the next 2 years, and so on. It was a very odd system, very inclined towards encourage people to spend money, which the Victorians were great on, and very sexist, like most of the Victorian society. For example, a woman couldn't marry in social terms years after her husband had died, but a man was expected to take a wife in the next 6 months because he needed her to look after the children. So that was very odd. So, so there's the book itself. It's the Crooked Medium's Guide to Murder. It has murders, seances, ghosts, alleged ghosts, um, double identities, hidden motives, inquests, trials, all sorts of things. Is a heap of fun. And I have the most wonderful cover. And you'll see on the cover there are laudanum, which is opium solution. There is foxgloves, which are poisonous. And there's a bee with blood on it, all of which are relevant in the book. And if you read the book, you'll understand why. So all that remains to happen is I need to tell you to follow the Red Rabbit Hole podcast, because they're completely bonkers and they might come and kidnap you and put you in a sack if you don't. My name's Stephen Cox. I hope you like the book. I hope it's like some of these weird facts. Thank you.